Yo, where is Greg? Promise tomorrow. I'm not trying to cram. Like, we have to get this done now.
Greg texted me. Said to meet in the park, but I don't really know where he is.
You should text him again, man, because we really need to get this done.
Yeah.
Is that Greg? Over
Where?
there?
Where?
By the trees, by the water.
By the trees? Is that him?
Yeah, let's catch up.
Is that a crocodile?
Yo, it is a crocodile. Yo!
12 seconds later.
Yo.
Greg, why are you fighting a crocodile?
Yo, they saw you guys. Photosynthesis, huh?
Let's get right into the
Plants. Photosynthesis.
The conversion process of photosynthetic organisms capturing light energy from and turning it into chemical energy that is stored in sugar and other organic molecules is photosynthesis. Now, there are many aspects of photosynthesis and the intricate details of how it works. Now let's begin where photosynthesis occurs. This will be the chloroplast within plant cells. The chloroplasts are plastids that contain chlorophyll, which is where photosynthesis takes place. Now another important part in the process of photosynthesis is the mesophyll cells, which happens to be split up between two types of cells, palisade parenchyma and spongy mesophyll. In the spongy mesophyll, photosynthesis is still occurring, but less compared to the palisade parenchyma, since there are large spaces left between the cells. These large spaces allow the layers to help carbon dioxide move around the cell. The spongy mesophyll also allows the plant to bend and move in the wind, which helps it move gases around the cell. Now the other part, the palisade parenchyma and the mesophyll layer, is where the main site of photosynthesis occurs in the leaf, since it contains a lot of chloroplasts in it, and chloroplasts, as you know, conducts photosynthesis. These cells are usually found near the surface of the leaf, under the epidermis, and there's usually just one layer of them. As mentioned earlier, the reason why photosynthesis occurs is to convert solar energy into chemical energy, which is then used or can be stored for further use. These stored chemical energies is usually in the glucose bonds of molecules. Photosynthesis has different parts. The two main parts I will be covering today will be non-cyclic and cyclic photophosphorylation, which is where energy derived from light is used to make ATP from ADP and PI. This will also be accompanied with the Calvin cycle and how it works. Let's begin with non-cyclic phosphorylation. Phosphorylation is the process of using energy derived from light to generate ATP from adenosine diphosphate, aka ADP, and PI, which is phosphorylation. Non-cyclic phosphorylation begins with photosystem 2 and follows 7 important steps. In photosystem 2, electrons are trapped by P680 and are energized by light. This can be seen in the figure provided in the left side, where the two electrons are moving up, showing an increase in energy. This step is then followed by primary electron acceptor, where two energized electrons are passed to a molecule called the primary electron acceptor. This acceptor is named primary since it's the first in the chain of other electron acceptors. Now if you're having trouble keeping up with the flow of this process, you can pause the video and follow each step with the accompanying number on the figure provided. On to step 3, which is the electron transfer chain. In this step, electrons pass through ETC, which has proteins in the thylakoid membrane and the chloroplast that pass electrons from one carrier protein to the next. A comparison can be drawn between the ETC in phosphorylation to those in the inner mitochondria membrane in oxidative. And that is the conclusion of our photosynthesis and respiration AP Bio video. On to our graphs. Lumen of the thylakoid. H+ ions accumulate here. 2. Intermembrane space. This is the narrow area between the inner membrane and outer membrane. 3. Inner membrane. This second membrane is also a double phospholipid bilayer. The fourth part is the stroma. The stroma is a fluid material that fills the area inside the inner membrane. The Calvin cycle occurs here, fixing carbon from CO2 to generate G3P, the precursor to glucose. The fifth part, thylakoids, suspended within the stroma, are stacked of pancake-like membranes. Individual membranes layers are thylakoids. An entire stack of thylakoids is a granum. The membranes of the thylakoids contain the protein complexes. Molecule is incorporated into F3P, thus making G3P a very energy-rich molecule. ADP, PI, and NADP plus are released and then re-energized in non-cyclic phosphorylation. The third part, regeneration, is where 6 ATP are used to convert 10 G3P to 6 RUBP. The regenerating 6 RUBP, originally used to combine with 6-CO2, allows the cycle to repeat. The last part, carbohydrate synthesis, note that 12 G3P were released in step 2, but only 10 were used in step 3. What happens to the remaining 2, you may ask? Well, the 2 remaining G3P are used to build glucose. Other monosaccharides like fructose and maltose can also be formed. In addition, glucose molecules can be combined to form disaccharides like sucrose and polysaccharides like starch and cellulose. It is also important to know that they can be energized again to participate in cyclic or non-cyclic phosphorylation. Cyclic phosphorylation occurs simultaneously with its non-cyclic counterpart to generate additional ATP. This is very important to understand and grasp, and may be tested on future quizzes and tests. 2 electrons passing through cyclic phosphorylation are generated on average 1 ATP. Onto the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle fixes CO2. That is, it takes the chemically unreactive inorganic CO2 and incorporates it into an organic molecule that can be used in biological systems. The biosynthetic pathway produces a single molecule of glucose. In order to accomplish this Calvin cycle, must repeat 6 times and use 6 CO2 molecules. That is why in the figure provided all the molecules are multiplied by 6. The first part I will cover is carbon fixation. In this part, 6 CO2 combined with 6 RUBP to produce 12 PJ. The enzyme reducer catalyzes the merging of CO2 and RUBP. The Calvin cycle is referred to as C3 photosynthesis because the first product formed PGA contains 3 carbon molecules. The next part, reduction, is where 12 ATP and 12 NADPH are used to convert 12 PGA to 12 G3P. The energy in the ATP and NADPH molecule is incorporated into F3P, thus making G3P a very energy-rich molecule. ADP, PI, and NADP plus are released and then re-energized in non-cyclic phosphorylation. The third part, regeneration, is where 6 ATP are used to convert 10 G3P to 6 RUBP. The regenerating 6 RUBP, originally used to combine with 6-CO2, allows the cycle to repeat. The last part, carbohydrate synthesis, note that 12 G3P were released in step 2, but only 10 were used in step 3. What happens to the remaining 2, you may ask? Well, the 2 remaining G3P are used to build glucose. Other monosaccharides like fructose and maltose can also be formed. In addition, glucose molecules can be combined to form disaccharides like sucrose and polysaccharides like starch and cellulose. It is also important to know that no light is directly used in the Calvin cycle. Thus, these reactions are often called light-independent reactions or dark reaction. But this is tricky since it does occur in the presence of light. This is due to the fact that it's dependent upon the energy from ATP and NADPH, and that these 2 energy-rich molecules can be created only during phosphorylation, which can only occur in the presence of light. This process can be summarized in this equation provided. Chloroplasts are the sites where both the light-dependent and light-independent reactions of photosynthesis occur. Chloroplasts consist of the following areas. Number 1. Outer membrane. This membrane, like the plasma membrane, consists of double layer of phospholipids. 2. Intermembrane space. This is the narrow area between the inner membrane and outer membrane. 3. Inner membrane. This second membrane is also a double phospholipid bilayer. The fourth part is the stroma. The stroma is a fluid material that fills the area inside the inner membrane. The Calvin cycle occurs here, fixing carbon from CO2 to generate G3P, the precursor to glucose. The fifth part, thylakoids, suspended within the stroma, are stacked of pancake-like membranes. Individual membranes layers are thylakoids. An entire stack of thylakoids is a granum. The membranes of the thylakoids contain the protein complexes, cytochromes, and the other electron carriers of the light-dependent reaction. The sixth part, thylakoid lumen. This is the inside or lumen of the thylakoid. H+ ions accumulate here. And that concludes our portion on photosynthesis, and now on to respiration. Here is Lewis presenting the main parts of mitochondria and respiration.
Parts of the mitochondria include the outer membrane, the inner membrane, the matrix, and the cristae. Alright. Cellular respiration is the process by which chemical energy of molecules is released and captured in the form of ATP. Similar to photosynthesis, cellular respiration is a chemical reaction. And here's the formula. You see, the difference is we're generating ATP at the end. The mitochondria uses glucose and oxygen, which breaks them down and gives energy to the cell, and the energy is used by us organisms. Many of our biological activities that happen in an organism's body need ATP. This is why ATP is an important molecule. When the cell uses ATP is converted to ADP. This reaction is called hydrolysis because a water molecule is needed for this conversion. So glucose is converted to 3 different stages: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So every stage is happening at the same time to work together to produce ATP. Glycolysis needs 2 ATP for it to work. It makes 4 ATPs as a result. It creates 2 pyruvate and 2 molecules of NADH. The compound is important to produce more ATP during aerobic or anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration occurs with oxygen. The first step to aerobic respiration is when pyruvate molecules go from the cytoplasm to the matrix of the mitochondria. And this process is called oxidation. CO2 is then split from the pyruvate. The remaining compound is then oxidized into an acetyl group. The following reactions create 2 protons and 2 electrons, which join NAD plus molecules to form NADH. The remaining proton is released as the H+ ion. A carrier called coenzyme A is linked together to form acetyl-CoA. This will help the Krebs cycle create more ATP. The Krebs cycle, which is also called the citric acid cycle, takes place in the matrix of the mitochondria. The 2 acetyls from acetyl-CoA molecules react with oxyl acetate molecules to create citric acid. And the products created by the citrate are 4 carbon dioxide, 6 NADH, and 2 FeC2. Citric acid is then converted back to oxaloacetate so that the cycle can repeat itself. The purpose of NADH and FeC2 is to carry electrons to the electron transport chain. Now, the products of the electron transport chain are ATP and H2O. The electron transport chain is located in the cristae. The electrons from the carrier molecules NADH and FADH2 are passed into a series of membrane bound proton pumps. For every pump, the electrons give energy to the 2 H+ ions on the membrane, and this makes a proton motor force. This causes ATP synthase to start the process of glycolysis. For For each glucose molecule, chemiosmosis produces A2 ATP. Water is then created from the leftover H plus ions and the oxygen. That's it. Sometimes muscles often use up oxygen too fast, and it must rely on lactic acid fermentation. When the lactic acid leaves you, you start to feel soreness and fatigue after doing physical activity. When oxygen becomes available again, the lactic acid is then converted to pyruvate. Another type of fermentation is alcohol fermentation. Different organisms like yeast and bacteria use a different pathway to convert NADH to NAD+. Instead of lactic acid, it uses ethanol. And we use this pathway to create alcoholic drinks like alcohol and beer. To summarize, cellular respiration is just a way to make energy out of glucose. And all living organisms do it. Sometimes muscles often use up oxygen too fast, and it must rely on lactic acid fermentation. When the lactic acid leaves you, you start to feel soreness and fatigue after doing physical activity. When oxygen becomes available again, the lactic acid is then converted to pyruvate. Another type of fermentation is alcohol fermentation. Different organisms like yeast and bacteria use a different pathway to convert NADH to NAD+. Instead of lactic acid, it uses ethanol. And we use this pathway to create alcoholic drinks like alcohol and beer. To summarize, cellular respiration is just a way to make energy out of glucose. And all living organisms do it.
Okay, now we're done with respiration, and now we're on to EJ with equations, graphs, and AP examples. We will now begin with the math and AP style questions.
There are 8 molecules of glucose. How much ATP is made?
That's what happens when you take some
Molecule of glucose. 2 ATP.
No.
Oh no, she took it while somebody did. I was going to be sharing with her. She just kept going. I was like, okay, but you're writing next to her. I gave you guys like that.
Did we put in work for this process? We work only for 30. Alright. I needed that for myself that I maybe do all the work.
There are 8 molecules. Finish my part.
Yeah, so you know how to frame. Yeah, usually you know how to frame it. You do a good like 20 questions.
Okay.
Sorry man, I have been called many things.
I said before, 1 molecule creates 2 ATP.
Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Taiwanese, any of the East Asian countries.
Disney is producing.
Ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. After school.
FADH2 is also
Yeah, it's just we're done filming voiceovers. I was gonna just put it yeah, because she had the program on the math, which makes the editing really easy. Yeah. That's why she volunteered to do the whole 2 periods, I think.
Example 1. What is the term used for the metabolic pathway in which glucose is degraded to carbon dioxide and water? A. Cellular respiration, B. Glycolysis, C. Fermentation, or D. Citric acid cycle? The answer is A. Cellular respiration. Example 2. Which of the following statements best describes the relationship between photosynthesis and respiration? A. Respiration is the reversal of the biochemical pathways of photosynthesis. B. Photosynthesis stores energy in complex organic molecules while respiration releases it. C. Photosynthesis occurs only in plants and respiration occurs only in animals. D. ATP molecules are produced in photosynthesis and used up in respiration. The answer is B. Photosynthesis stores energy in complex organic molecules while respiration releases it.
Now that we've completed our AP questions and math equations, we can now move on to our graphs.
A good example of humans using both aerobic and anaerobic respiration is when we exercise. Our bodies rapidly break down natural sources of ATP like fats and carbs to help fuel itself. On the graph shown, the x-axis represents the VO2 max percent, which is the measurement of the maximum amount of oxygen one uses during exercise. This helps us determine the intensity of the exercise. The y-axis shows a percentage in which the body uses either fats or carbs. On the key provided, the use of carbohydrates means that there is lactate production, while the use of triglycerides or fats means that there is no lactate production. As the intensity of the exercise increases, lactate production also increases. This is an indicator that there is less oxygen being consumed by the body and anaerobic respiration takes place to provide ATP. By analyzing this graph further, you can infer that the muscles are also being fatigued as lactic acid is produced more. You can also infer that the more intense the workout, the more carbs needed by the body rather than fats. This is due to the fact that carbohydrates are more simple in terms of molecular structure than triglycerides, so when the body is under anaerobic respiration, it is able to work less in order to provide you with energy sufficiently. The body is able to break down triglycerides more easily when oxygen is readily available, meaning aerobic respiration is going on. An example of such an exercise in which your body is using aerobic respiration would be jogging. A more intense workout like weight training is an example where your body is using anaerobic respiration. Wavelength in nanometers is absorbed. By analyzing this graph, you can infer that the absorption of light directly correlates with the rate of photosynthesis. This can be seen when the wavelength is about 410 to 420 nanometers and at 670 to 680 nanometers. The percent of light absorbed is about 55% and 50% respectively.
And that is the conclusion of our photosynthesis and respiration AP Bio video.